Have you ever noticed how fear has its own way of showing up? It doesn't arrive with screams or lightning. It comes quietly, disguised as concern, as logic, as self-protection. And before you realize it, it's already living inside your mind, taking the place where peace used to rest. Fear is a constant whisper, and if you let it, it begins to set the rhythm of your soul. Maybe you know that voice well, the one that speaks when everything goes silent, that reminds you of what went wrong, that makes the future look bigger than God. It doesn't shout, but it wounds. It doesn't push, but it paralyzes. And even though you know it's just a thought, it feels like a prison, because fear doesn't need bars. It only needs your attention. But fear is not the final voice. The Bible says, "Do not fear, for I am with you." And if God is with you, then fear is only an echo, loud but hollow. Fear speaks of what could happen. God speaks of what has already happened, the cross, the victory, the presence that never leaves. While fear feeds on uncertainty, faith stands on the memory of what God has already done. Even the prophets were afraid. Elijah ran away exhausted, ready to give up. But God found him in the hiding place, and he didn't rebuke him. He didn't come with thunder or fire, but with a gentle whisper. A sound so soft that only a broken heart could hear it. That's how God speaks to the fearful, not with force, but with tenderness. Because God doesn't overcome fear by shouting louder, he overcomes it by coming closer. While fear roars, God simply whispers, "I'm still here." And that whisper changes everything. It doesn't silence the storm, but it changes how you walk through it. Maybe fear is still there, whispering even now. But remember, faith is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to trust even while trembling. Peter began to sink when he took his eyes off Jesus, but his hand never stopped reaching out. Fear has no power over the one who remembers who holds them. So take a deep breath. Don't fight fear. Just listen to what is stronger than it. Fear may whisper to paralyze you, but grace whispers too, to remind you that you were never alone. And in that voice, soft and steady, the soul finds its rest again. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it only whispers, in the still hours of the night, when the mind is awake but the body is tired. It speaks through memories, through possibilities, through questions that have no answer. The sound of fear is subtle, yet persistent. It doesn't just want to scare you, it wants to become part of your routine, and the more you listen, the louder it seems. It comes dressed as logic. What if it doesn't work? What if God doesn't show up this time? These phrases echo inside the soul until the heart begins to shrink. Fear doesn't need noise to dominate, only space. And when faith grows silent, fear finds room to speak. But there's something fear will never understand. It speaks of what might happen, while God speaks of what has already been decided. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Isaiah 41:10. Fear shows danger. God shows presence. Fear wants to appear invincible, but it's only a shadow. And every shadow depends on light to exist. Fear lives off the very thing it tries to extinguish, hope. That's why faith doesn't need to shout louder than fear. It just needs to light a small candle and let God's presence slowly illuminate what once felt too dark. Think of how many times fear has convinced you that it was the end, and yet you kept going. There's a reason for that. Fear lies, but God remains. He is the voice that never changes, even when all others seem louder. He is the calm that walks through the storm, not because it ended, but because he's in the middle of it. And if fear speaks about tomorrow, God speaks about today. He doesn't ask you to see the whole path, only to trust the next step. His presence is not a distant promise, it's a constant companion. And when the heart remembers that, the sound of fear begins to fade, like an echo dissolving in the wind. Because in the end, fear is not what defines you. It's only what tries to distract you. What truly sustains you is the one who walks beside you, even when you still feel afraid. And in his presence, the heart learns to rest, preparing to understand what fear is really trying to do. Fear doesn't come just to scare, it comes to control. It has no face, no shape, but it slips quietly into ordinary thoughts. It speaks with the voice of prudence, logic, and caution. Better not try. Wait a little longer. Don't take the risk. And so, fear disguises its true intent, domination. It wants you to confuse safety with stagnation and discernment with distrust in God. There's a dangerous subtlety in the words of fear. It doesn't deny God's existence. It just suggests that he might not be enough. It doesn't say God failed. It only whispers, what if he fails this time? It's a slow poison that paralyzes the soul while pretending to protect it. Because fear wears the mask of reason, but works like a thief, stealing peace in the name of prudence. The Bible says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment. The one who fears has not been made perfect in love. Enter John 4:18. Fear tries to convince you that God is an impatient judge, not a present father. It wants you to believe that his love depends on your performance. But perfect love doesn't cast out fear. It casts roots. It grounds the heart in what is eternal. Notice how fear always talks about what you cannot control. It traps you in futures that don't yet exist and pulls you away from the only place where grace operates, the present. God doesn't work in hypotheticals, he works in open hearts. So when fear tries to paint the future in dark tones, faith responds by remembering what God has already colored with promises. Often, fear presents itself as a friend. It promises to protect, but it imprisons. It promises stability, but kills movement. What once felt like safety becomes emotional captivity. Fear is not a companion, it's an imposter. And every time it convinces you to stop, it teaches you to doubt the God who called you to move forward. Faith doesn't need to deny fear. It just needs to decide whom to listen to. When the heart chooses to trust, even while trembling, fear loses its authority, because fear feeds on control, but faith blossoms in surrender. When you release what you were trying to hold, God takes what was always his. Fear whispers to make you retreat, but grace whispers to remind you, you are not alone. And in that contrast of voices, the Holy Spirit begins to teach discernment, to recognize the sound of fear and choose the voice of peace. And it's there, in that awareness, that the question arises, where does this voice truly come from? Not every voice inside you comes from you. Some were born out of fear, others out of pain, and some were planted by experiences that still hurt. They are echoes of the past, trying to define the present. The problem is that over time, those voices start to blend, and the heart begins to believe that everything it feels is truth. But feeling fear is not the same as living by it. The difference lies in which voice you choose to feed. Often, fear disguises itself as wisdom. It uses elegant words, cautious advice, and seemingly spiritual excuses. Maybe God doesn't want it right now. Maybe it's not for you. And in doing so, fear dresses in reverence, but carries the essence of doubt. The enemy doesn't need to deny your faith, only to distort it. He knows that a twisted truth can still hold the heart captive. That's why the Bible is so clear. For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. 2 Timothy 1:7. Fear is not just an emotion, it's a spirit that tries to govern. But the Spirit of God works differently. He doesn't dominate, he frees, he doesn't oppress, he strengthens. His power doesn't remove you from battles, it sustains you through them. There's a silent war happening in the mind. On one side, the voice of fear, fed by memories and dark predictions. On the other, the voice of faith, speaking through the word, even when everything seems against it. Faith doesn't need evidence to speak. It only needs remembrance, because what God has already said is enough to sustain what you cannot yet see. That's why reading the Bible is not just a religious habit, it's an act of spiritual resistance. Every verse is like an anchor thrown into a storm. When fear raises the wind of doubt, the word steadies the soul's ship. God's voice doesn't compete with fear, it exposes it. Fear speaks in what-ifs, but God speaks in "it is finished." Recognizing that difference takes time. Fear is persistent, sometimes even convincing. It feeds on silence, while faith blooms in it. So when fear speaks, the answer is not to debate, it's to remember. Remember who God is. Remember what He's done. Remember that no voice can silence what He has already declared over your life. Fear may whisper, but grace speaks louder. And when the heart begins to discern between these voices, the path to freedom opens. Because feeling fear is natural, but living under its rule is forgetting who's in control. And that's what the next step will reveal. Feeling fear is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of being human. The problem is not feeling it, but settling in it. When fear is entertained for too long, it starts to build a home. It rearranges the furniture of the soul and convinces you that living on alert is the same as being safe. But living like that is exhausting because the heart was never made to live in trenches. It was made to trust. Even the prophets felt fear. Elijah, for example, was a man of extraordinary faith, yet deep anguish. After great victories, he ran, exhausted, discouraged, ready to give up. The same man who faced kings and false prophets now hid inside a cave. That's what fear does. It turns warriors into fugitives, heroes into shadows of themselves. But it was there, in the hiding place, that God found him. And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" 1 Kings 19:9. God didn't ask because he didn't know. He asked so Elijah would remember who he was. Fear tries to define you by your moment. God calls you by your purpose. God didn't rebuke Elijah. He didn't come with thunder or lightning, but with a gentle whisper. Fear expected judgment. God brought presence. And in that contrast, the heart learns what grace truly is. Not the absence of failure, but the constancy of a love that never gives up. Fear shouts, "You failed," but God whispers, "There's still a way." There's relief in knowing that even the strongest have been afraid, because it reminds us that fear doesn't separate us from God. It only shows how much we need Him. The problem is not being afraid. It's stopping because of it. And even when fear tries to freeze your steps, grace always offers a restart. So when fear appears, don't deny it. Just don't feed it. Look to God and say, "I'm still afraid, but I'm still with you." That simple phrase is faith in the form of surrender. It's the reminder that fear doesn't have to leave for trust to begin growing. And if these words are touching your heart right now, maybe this is a good moment not to walk alone. Because the journey continues, and in the next step, we'll hear the whisper that silences fear. If this reflection is meeting you where you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribe and let these quiet words find you again. God doesn't speak through the noise of fear, but through the calm of His presence. Fear makes noise. God speaks softly. While the world demands immediate answers, heaven works in silence. It's in the space between despair and rest that God's whisper becomes audible. He doesn't compete with fear, He simply speaks deeper. The sound of grace doesn't come to dominate, it comes to heal. When Elijah waited to hear God in powerful displays, in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, none of them held His presence. It came after the fire in a gentle and quiet whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. God didn't need spectacle to prove He was there. His voice was enough. Because what conquers fear is not the volume of faith, but the intimacy with a God who speaks softly. Many times, fear feeds on the noise of the mind. When we try to control everything, the soul grows restless. But God doesn't speak in the rush. He speaks in the stillness. That's why the silence you fear may actually be the place He chose to teach you how to listen. Faith grows when the heart learns to tell the difference between absence and silence. Think of how many times you've asked for a sign and received no immediate reply. Maybe God was already answering, not with words, but with peace. The whisper of God is a presence that replaces explanation with assurance. When He speaks, fear doesn't vanish instantly, but it loses authority, because where His presence abides, panic cannot. That whisper doesn't bring promises of control, but of company. It doesn't say, "It won't hurt," but it assures, "You won't be alone." And it's in that quiet school of trust that the heart grows stronger. Faith isn't loud, it's steady. It's the whisper that survives the thunder. Fear shouts that God has gone away. The whisper replies, "I'm still here." That's the difference between despair and hope. One voice speaks of endings, the other of endurance. And when the heart begins to recognize that voice, chaos loses its grip. Because faith is not the absence of noise, it's the presence of direction. Maybe this is the invitation now, to pause for a moment and listen. Not to the news, not to fear, not to what could have been, but to the voice still saying, "I am with you." That's the voice that guides the next step, the voice that turns fear into trust. Fear almost always begins with the attempt to control what doesn't belong to us. It appears when the soul tries to hold with its hands what God asked it to release. And the more we try to control, the more insecure we become. Fear is the symptom of misplaced trust. Trust put in our strength, our predictions, our plans. Control is the hidden way of saying, "I don't trust enough." Peter discovered this in the middle of a stormy sea. He was walking on water with his eyes fixed on Jesus until something within him shifted. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Matthew 14:30. The wind wasn't new. It had always been there. What changed was his focus. Fear didn't begin with the storm. It began when Peter looked at it. It's the same with us. The waves don't drown us. The diverted gaze does. Fear doesn't grow because the problem is too big, but because faith shrinks before it. God doesn't ask us to ignore the sea, only to remember who walks above it. Trust doesn't erase fear. It puts it in its proper size. To control is to try to play God, to write the ending before living the story. But faith doesn't need to know the ending. It only needs to know the author. And when the heart learns this, control begins to turn into rest. The soul stops fighting the unpredictable and starts resting in the sovereignty of the one who's never late. True trust is born when we accept that we have no control, but we do have company. Fear isolates, trust draws near. When you release what you were trying to hold, the presence of God fills the empty space. What once felt like loss becomes freedom. Control is heavy, but trust is light. Maybe that's why Jesus could sleep in the middle of the storm. He knew the sea could never overpower the one who created it. It wasn't control that kept him in peace. It was confidence. And that same peace is what he offers to anyone who learns to rest instead of dominate. Fear is not defeated by force, but by surrender. And as the heart lets go of control, fear reveals something we rarely notice, that it's not an enemy to destroy, but a mirror to understand. And that's exactly what the next step will show. Fear doesn't come only to challenge, it comes to reveal. It shows where faith still needs to mature. Every fear that arises is a mirror pointing to an area of the heart not yet fully surrendered. Sometimes it's not about the problem itself, but about what it exposes. Fear becomes a sacred reminder. Here is something you're still trying to hold on your own. When fear appears, God doesn't step away. He watches. not with reproach but with purpose. He allows fear to visit so that we may see what still needs to be healed. Fear is a harsh teacher, but a tool in the hands of a patient father. It doesn't come to destroy, it comes to reveal dependence. Paul wrote, "Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves." 2 Corinthians 13:5. That examination is not guilt, it's awareness. It's understanding that faith doesn't grow in comfort, but in the tension between what we fear and what we believe. Fear is the soil where God plants courage. It's the contrast that makes the light of trust shine brighter. Think of Abraham climbing the mountain with Isaac. Fear must have been there, breathing beside him, whispering, "What if God doesn't provide?" But Abraham kept walking, and at the exact moment he lifted the knife, the angel spoke. Fear didn't disappear before the altar, it was defeated upon it. Faith doesn't wait for fear to leave, it chooses to move forward while trembling. When surrendered to God, fear becomes a tool for discernment. It shows the boundaries of our surrender. It reveals whether we trust the outcome or the character of God. And in that honesty, the heart is shaped, because fear is only dangerous when it's hidden. Once confessed, it loses its power. God doesn't waste fear. He turns it into an invitation to surrender. Every time fear tries to close doors, grace opens windows. Every time anxiety tries to dominate the scene, God's presence is remembered, reminding us we're not alone in the inner battle. Fear may reflect weakness, but God reflects purpose. And when that revelation happens, something begins to change. The fear that once paralyzed now teaches. The heart that once ran now remains, because fear stops being an enemy when it's laid at the feet of Christ. And from that encounter, a new step is born, the kind of trust that blossoms even while fear is still near. Trust doesn't begin when fear disappears. It begins when the heart chooses to stay, even while trembling. Faith is not the absence of emotion, it's the direction of the will. God never promised we wouldn't feel fear. He promised to be with us in it. And in that quiet coexistence between fear and divine presence, the heart learns what it means to rest. The psalmist wrote, "When I am afraid, I will trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust and will not be afraid. What can man do to me?" Psalm 56:3-4. He didn't wait for fear to fade to trust. He trusted in the middle of it. Trust is not the absence of trembling. It's the decision to move forward even with a racing heart. God's grace doesn't erase fear in a single moment. It turns it into a teacher. Every time you trust, fear loses a little more of its voice. What once was noise becomes reminder. You are being strengthened. Fear doesn't vanish, it simply changes places. From master, it becomes servant. From threat, it becomes testimony. Think of Daniel walking down into the lion's den. Fear must have been there, but it wasn't at the center. The presence of God was. Trust didn't keep him out of danger, it sustained him within it. That's mature faith. It doesn't demand an easy path, it only ensures steady steps. Fear keeps roaring, but it no longer leads the rhythm. When the soul chooses trust, fear loses its power to define tomorrow. Faith looks at the same scene, but sees a different ending. Fear says, "It will go wrong." Faith replies, "Even then, God is with me." That kind of trust turns nights into altars and tears into seeds. Fear may still exist, but trust takes the lead. Over time, that decision becomes natural. The heart begins to recognize presence before it senses danger. It's like a melody that plays again when the mind starts to drift. Trust is not a permanent state, it's a daily practice, a quiet act of remembering again and again that the hand holding you is steadier than the ground beneath you. And if something within you feels that transformation beginning, hold on to this moment, because the next step in the journey shows what happens when that silent trust begins to bear fruit, not the kind of victory that shows off, but the kind that endures in secret. If this speaks to your soul, walk with us. one quiet video at a time. The victory of a Christian rarely comes with applause. It happens in places no one sees, in the dark room of the mind, in prayers that are never posted, in tears that fall in silence. The world measures victory by noise, but heaven measures it by endurance. True faith doesn't need a stage. It blossoms from the soil of perseverance. Jesus conquered in the silence of a cross. No choir applauded him that day. There was pain, abandonment, and darkness. But there, in what looked like defeat, love was winning. And when he declared, "It is finished," heaven applauded what earth could not understand. That's the essence of silent victory. It doesn't depend on recognition, but on obedience. The Bible reminds us, "Do not be afraid, just believe." Mark 5:36. Jesus said that to a father who had just received the worst news possible. His daughter was dead. In that moment, fear had arguments, but faith had presence. The victory began before the resurrection, when that man chose to keep walking with Jesus even without understanding. That's how God wins inside of us. Victory doesn't start when everything changes on the outside, but when something grows still within. When the soul, even wounded, says, "I still trust." When fear still speaks, but no longer rules. When pain still exists, but no longer defines purpose. A victorious Christian isn't one who feels less. It's one who remains longer. Silent victory happens in the space between prayer and answer. It's the place where God shapes us without witnesses, only with his presence. It's when you stand up for the 1,000th time, weary but willing to try again. That persistence isn't stubbornness. It's matured faith. It's the confidence that the God who began his work is still working, even when the result is unseen. Many confuse victory with emotion, but it's actually a posture. It's choosing peace over anxiety, forgiveness over bitterness, worship over despair. These choices make no noise, but they move heaven. Every quiet decision to trust is a seed planted in eternity's ground. Time may hide the fruit, but God watches it bloom. Maybe you don't feel like you've won. Maybe fear still circles your thoughts and circumstances haven't changed. But if you're still praying, still seeking, still believing, that's victory. Because faith that endures before the miracle is stronger than faith that celebrates after. Heaven moves when a heart chooses to stay. This is the kind of victory the world can't understand. The one that rests while waiting, that smiles through fatigue, that worships while still in pain. It's the victory that doesn't need to prove anything, because it was already sealed at the cross. Every quiet step toward trust is an invisible declaration that God still reigns, even when life feels uncertain. And in that victorious silence, fear finally grows quiet. Because the heart understands, victory is not a destination. It's a presence. The presence of the God who sustains, comforts, and remains. And when that truth comes alive within the soul, fear loses its meaning. Faith doesn't just endure, it blooms. And in that atmosphere of surrender and rest, we reach the final step of this journey. Fear may still whisper, but now we know. Grace speaks louder. Fear may keep whispering, but the soul now recognizes the sound of grace. It tries to return, like wind against a window, but finds no home. The heart has learned that fear is not the end. It's only the echo of something already defeated. Fear speaks of what could happen, but faith speaks of what's already fulfilled. And what was fulfilled on the cross is unchangeable. Love has won. God holds what you cannot sustain, and that changes everything. You're not the one who needs to control the wind. He's the one who commands the sea. Your faith doesn't need to be perfect. His presence simply needs to be remembered. Because even when fear grows louder, grace stands firm, whispering, "I'm still here." That's the secret of peace. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of God within it. You may still feel your heart racing, your hands cold, your mind restless. That's not a lack of faith. It's only your body remembering what your spirit has already learned to release. And this is where faith becomes real, not as belief alone, but as rest. Faith is not a theory of control. It's the gesture of surrender. So, if you can, take a piece of paper. Write down what's been causing you fear. It could be a name, a situation, a doubt, or something you can't even put into words. Write slowly, without rush, as one who pours a burden before God. Then hold that paper for a moment. Feel what it represents. Take a deep breath and quietly say, "I'm in your hands." That gesture is simple, yet it carries a profound truth. Because it's not the paper that matters. It's the act of letting go. It's the moment when control leaves your hands and returns to the altar. If you wish, place it inside your Bible as a reminder that God is taking care of it. Or if you prefer, tear it, not as escape, but as faith. What's been surrendered to God no longer has power to imprison you. The Bible says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Psalm 23:4. That verse doesn't promise the absence of valleys. It promises company within them. God doesn't remove the valley, He enters it with you. And when that presence is recognized, fear loses its dominion. The soul begins to walk differently after that. It still feels the wind, but it no longer panics. It still sees shadows, but it trusts the light. Because fear is no longer master, it's witness. A witness to the faithfulness of a God who never let go of your hand, even when you doubted. His love is patient enough to wait until your heart finds rest again. And maybe this is that moment to close your eyes and simply listen to the silence. The same silence where God speaks deepest. The same silence Elijah heard on the mountain and Jesus embraced in Gethsemane. The same silence where faith stops being theory and becomes communion. Take a deep breath. Let your soul rest. You are safe in the hands that never fail. Fear may never disappear completely. It will always try to find small openings, an old memory, an uncertain future, a voice that still dares to doubt. But now, it no longer sounds the same. The heart has learned to recognize another voice, softer, steadier, one that doesn't speak of threat, but of companionship, the voice of the Good Shepherd, the one who doesn't shout in the storm, but walks beside us through it. That's the difference between those who live in fear and those who live in faith. Fear tries to control, faith learns to rest. Fear demands explanations, faith seeks presence. Fear says, "What if?" Faith answers, "Even then." And in that silent dialogue, the soul matures. Because the victory of the believer is not to never feel fear again. It's to remember every time it returns, who's still in control. The presence of God doesn't erase pain, it redefines it. He doesn't remove the valley, He turns the valley into a path. The psalmist didn't say, "I will avoid the valley," but "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Psalm 23:4. It's that presence that changes everything. The landscape may remain the same, but the soul finds a new place to rest. Jesus knew what fear felt like. In Gethsemane, He sweat blood, prayed through tears, and asked for the cup to pass, yet finished by saying, "Your will be done." That was the height of trust. The victory wasn't only at the cross. It began in the garden, where surrender overcame control. And every time you say, "I'm in your hands," heaven remembers that garden. That's where surrender becomes strength. Maybe fear will visit you again in the days to come, in the form of anxiety, doubt, or the feeling that God has gone silent. When it does, return to this moment. Remember the words, the silence, the gesture. Remember that grace never leaves, it simply speaks softer. And in that gentle whisper, The soul realigns with truth. You are safe in the hands that never let go. And if something in this reflection found your heart, don't let this voice be drowned out by the noise of the world. If this reflection is meeting you where you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribe and let these quiet words find you again. Fear may keep whispering, but now you know there's another voice, deeper, older, faithful. And this voice doesn't speak of fear. It speaks of love, it speaks of peace, it speaks of grace, because in the end, the story doesn't end with the sound of fear, but with the whisper of hope. And that whisper is Christ himself.